Hello. So today I'm going to talk about what it's been like still living here in Buenos Aires, exploring Latin American politics at this immersive level for about now the past 5 months. I attended a lecture with Horacio Jaunarena, who was a former defense minister under Argentina's first democratic administration during the democratic transition period of Raúl Alfonsín, the former president following the dictatorship, where Jaunarena spoke about his book alongside with other scholars about the transitional period that Argentina went through and the necessary context that we should take into consideration when judging the democratic transitional period that the government led at this time. Now, Alfonsín's government has widely been perceived as an unsuccessful economic failure in terms of hyperinflation and him leaving the office after massive unrest. What Jaunarena and his colleagues described during this period was that following a largely undemocratic era as Argentina endured for a decade, there was a necessity for this transitional government to do things that were not particularly popular, including working in accordance with the preceding dictatorship governance, and because of the sensitivity that any democratic transitional phase is almost bound to endure, and Argentina is no exception to this. This time saw the removal of ministers after ministers and the Alfonsín's government being stalled and proceeding with actions in the face of opposition. But these lecturers spoke about the bigger picture work of the administration that in a way becomes unnoticed at times. And it is in working for a more noble cause, in pushing for a change in the overall democratic attitudes rather than the clear success of the Alfonsín's government. This concept resonated with me when we think about government work in general, where we don't always praise leaders and those who work in the maintenance of state systems, including democracy, during a very sensitive time as a transition from a dictatorship rule to democratic leadership is truly no exception to this. The lecturers refer to how the administration's goal was to change the national attitudes and values for democratic ones, as the dictatorship was not entirely supported by its leaders, but also by those who lived under its rule. Now, this is a common theme witnessed in other political phenomenons where the true goal does not necessarily lie in overnight success or even after 10 years of reaching this goal, but is instead on an ongoing goal with no definite endpoint to its largely perceived success. So democratic transitions prove the same and perhaps even more volatile for reaching these types of large-scale goals. When considering a country like Syria, as I started to analyze, that is freshly liberated from a half-century dictatorship, the democratic process might not be fully actualized in the next 10 or 50 years if it continues down this democratic transition, during which the first democratic transitional actions might be controversially debated over its faults and inherent successes. So overall, the lecturers taught me an important lesson on the goals of something as grand as democratic transition in a former despotic state, where the goal of changing minds at a national level might come at the cost of even being perceived as an incompetent administration or possibly even the enemy of something. If it means achieving a grander plan, or one might not live to see this plan become realized, this might be the true goal that we should really judge something like the Alfonsín government in Argentina. I also attended a lecture of Gabriel Kessler, who has been studying the different levels of discontent in Latin America, and he educated me on different ways of evaluating discontent in this region. One is the relative deprivation between those who have more and those who have less that we see in Latin America, and it's just proving to be becoming a more increasingly prevalent phenomenon in this area, especially since the end of the wide-scale dictatorship era of the late 20th century. He also pointed out the awareness of inequality, which has been amplified since that time in the post years, as well as through social media's ability to demonstrate more of what goes on in the world than had been noticed before. Additionally, Kessler mentioned that even though social indexes are indicating that life is getting better in most Latin American countries than they were before, this isn't something that is felt to the same extent across these countries. What I found most fascinating from this was just how applicable this is to like the United States and what is similarly a felt high level of discontent that we have noticed for some time now, especially when we consider social media's social disruption ability into how we perceive society. This type of discontent and being able to observe just how unequal one's society truly is, and how even though we see social well-being and opportunities increase through expanded lifespans and in more efficient and accessible technologies, this is not clearly translated into higher levels of social contentedness. Latin America proves itself an interesting case because in a post-dictatorship transitional phase, one might almost falsely think that before times, the dictatorship was probably not as horrible as it is remembered, because when we see something like Brazil's big cities' stark inequality, we almost think that this is possibly an even worse thing, considering the scale we can see this, especially through something like social media. But in fact, what makes this time feel different than before is truly this awareness, as I already said, that we gain by society's integration of more voices who haven't benefited from the institutions of today. What we see here is not necessarily a worsening world in a region like Latin America that we should necessarily perceive as, but more of a deeper awareness of the reality of the world and its structures. This is something to be cautious of, so that the growth and scale does seem to come across as an issue with modern society. It becomes conflated with this issue of just advancements in society as a product of democratic and globalizing changes, which could be what might propel populist politics. The world is becoming more personally defined to an individual scale. It's why even though we read that Chile is one of the safest countries in Latin America, the sentiment remains for many Chileans that very strong, and regardless of the data say this, for Chileans to vote for a far-right law and order president who has a history of supporting the Pinochet dictatorship, all in an effort of trying to control immigration and the fears of crime worsening. So Latin America is undergoing a shift that is similar in other parts of the world, where sentiment is able to trump reason and data when it comes to improved qualities of life and levels of discontent. I also visited Uruguay recently and learned about its dictatorship and democratic transition that it took in the 80s. And there were many distinctions and similarities I noticed between Uruguay and Argentina that might speak on why these two states are at the points where they are today. The post-dictatorship democratic process has proven itself more successful in Uruguay than in Argentina by various scales of democracy and development indexes, and is similar to the Argentine-Chilean contexts on state terrorism memory that I evaluated in the before video, where Uruguay has adopted a more anti-dictatorship role nationally in its current democratic outlook than Argentina has to that same scale. Whereas the Falkland Islands Wars is almost the unifier for Argentines in recent historical memory, Uruguay, and Montevideo specifically, has explicitly perceived the dictatorship as a tragedy in its history, the civil-military dictatorship, and has a higher culture of accountability seeking for that era's exploits, which correlates with the high democratic values that Uruguay has been known for upholding better than most Latin American countries. So the urban population phenomenon in Uruguay is also worth considering. Most of the country lives in urban spaces, and thus its democratic results will tend to align on an urban majority, especially in Montevideo, containing over half of the Uruguayan population. Now, Argentina, on the other hand, is not as centrally urbanized in Buenos Aires, its capital, as Uruguay is with Montevideo's population. Instead, it has a more sparse but still urban scale in Argentina. So this might be significant and worth considering in how Argentina also votes more conservatively, at least compared to Uruguay, and not as democratically aligned, just compared to Uruguay, because as Uruguay continues to be viewed as the largely successful case of democracy and even progressive politics. So then this might also have to do with the inherent problem of just how we measure democratic success in countries, since Uruguay's high success also correlates with its progressive, urban, and largely left-wing politics. It could be that those democratic indexes have a bias in this context, or it could be that the right-wing / conservative politics in this region just truly tend to not necessarily prioritize democratic values in the way that the left and more progressive side might. This outlook could be valid in perceiving how conservative supporters of these states might be in support of the older systems from the dictatorship era, or might not necessarily like the liberalizing of policies that have developed in their respective states post-dictatorship. So either way, Uruguay shows how this phenomenon of a post-dictatorship transition might be reliant on urban concentration in a country towards its democratic development. So both Uruguay and Argentina do share similar values and defining characteristics in its mass migration from Europe and the social welfare values many from that region brought with them to these countries. And that in itself might also show how the importation of values that have birthed from Europe largely, like social safety nets and the upholding of democratic institutions, has played a significant role in the high democratic indexes these countries have expressed compared to ones with not as much European immigrants. Uruguay, in essence, is an example of a similar orientation Argentina could have taken in its similar history through a more centralized single-city majority rule than the not as urbanized and more sparse in cities like Argentina has. The urban relationship between state and city is another factor to consider in a state's democratic development, as well as the constant theme that we see in history of successful democracies in regions like Athens in ancient Greece, the city-state, or even Geneva during its time as an independent city-state. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.